Michael Byram started out the son of a tailor and a first-generation university student who taught French and German in high school and adult education. In 1980, he became a university professor and is now among a select few who designed the Council of Europe's reference framework of competences for democratic culture. As the stability of democracies in the Western world has come under scrutiny, this expert of and advocate for intercultural communicative competence strongly believes in the necessity to teach intercultural citizenship at every level of education. Michael Byram shares with us how he arrived at a point in his career that has politicized his convictions such that they now affect policy in the European Union. Michael, thank you very, very, very much for taking the time to ponder, negotiate, discuss the concept of conviction. And I'm just really honored to have you as really the authority on intercultural competence and intercultural education and intercultural citizenship here to tell us a little bit more about what that is and also about your own path towards that, because from what I learned, you started off in Danish literature.
That's right.
And now you are a much valued member of the Council of Europe in education. And I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about that arc.
Right. Well, it's over many years, so I'll keep it relatively short. I studied foreign languages at Cambridge and started with French and German. For various accidental reasons, became interested in Scandinavian literature, and after I'd finished my bachelor's, my BA, well, my choices were, I was interested either in going into applied linguistics and language teaching, but then I became interested in a particular author, and I was lucky that I got some funding, and I took my 3 years over doing a PhD on Danish literature on a particular author. Tom Christensen. After that, that might have led me into becoming a university lecturer in linguistics, in Scandinavian studies. But I then went back to the other point. I wanted to do something a bit more practical, language teaching, applied linguistics, and so on. I became a school teacher, a teacher in secondary education for young people from 13 to 18, teaching them French and German. Then became a language teacher trainer. In the course of the teaching in schools and training teachers, I began to wonder about what I called at the time, the cultural dimension of communication. And trying to think a bit more about how we could systematically teach a cultural dimension, however you define that, rather than it just being something which is added on to language teaching in a narrow sense. And one thing led to another. That led me to some work in the Council of Europe when I began to publish on this dimension of language teaching. And my work at the Council of Europe for the first 20 years or so was very much with the language policy division, language teaching focus. I used to do workshops and that kind of thing with them, and then the concepts also became a little bit more complex, and I began to understand myself what the cultural dimension might mean in practice and indeed in a more sophisticated theory. So then latterly, the first shift in focus was from foreign language, or as you call it here, world language teaching, and work with the Council of Europe on that, to developing a program and a model and eventually a platform of work which would help educationists, whether teachers or people in ministries, as it were, and anywhere in between, on the topic of what we call the language of schooling. In other words, the language through which one learns. One learns throughout one's schooling, whatever the subject, whatever the topic. And then that too has a cultural dimension, but another thing came along, and that was the question of developing a project which took up the notion of intercultural dialogue, which from about 2008 onwards became a theme of the Council of Europe, intercultural dialogue, and we began to develop a framework, so-called framework, to define and describe the competences needed for intercultural dialogue, and then eventually that was linked to citizenship, education, and what became competences for democratic culture. That's the short version of the whole thing. So the theme of intercultural competence started in language teaching, thinking, well, you know, in order to interact with someone from another country and really interact successfully and really understand their perspective, one needs more than a narrow perspective, a narrow language learning. It's got to be a question of skills, knowledge, and attitudes which are beyond simply learning how to communicate in a narrow sense. And in the language teaching world, that meant going beyond the notion of communicative language teaching to what eventually we began to call intercultural communicative language teaching.
Yes, I well remember in my own training coming across that concept 1997 when I myself was coming from Germany to the US, teaching German as a foreign language and realizing, well, wait a minute, you know, just dealing with words and phrases and teaching products of cultural groups really does not tell you anything about the perspectives or getting even close to the perspectives. If you want to take the iceberg model, let's say. And so it's been a real learning curve for me now that I teach intercultural communication myself, wondering, well, how do I get to this self-reflective element of, well, I can teach language until I get green in the face, but that doesn't necessarily mean I teach intercultural competence. That's a very different thing. Friday, you described yourself primarily as an educator.
Yes.
You're many more things. And so I'm sort of trying to find out a little bit more where that, what sounds like a very strong identity comes from, and what, let's talk about convictions, what convictions sort of led you in that direction.
Yes. Well, perhaps I understand that in the United States the word educator can sometimes be used simply to mean teacher.
Correct. Yeah.
I would perhaps use the word educationist, partly because I want to emphasize by that I was for many years in a school of education, not in an applied linguistics department, for example, out of which many people go into or come into and go out of applied linguistics into language teaching, particularly English as a foreign language. Typically people go do their initial period of practice and then take their masters in applied linguistics. But for me, working within an education department, first of all, it brings you into contact with people beyond languages,
of course.
Which in an applied linguistics situation and department is not the case. And in that sense, I also have always seen, and this is connected with the convictions notion, that at least in English-speaking countries, but I think also in every country, when a language is taught within compulsory education, then it ought to be not just a matter of learning the skills of communication, even if we're taking a perspective which is a little richer than purely language. It's not just a matter of communication skills. It's also a matter of being part of the education process, of educating young people. The word in German is Bildung. In Scandinavian they call it Dannelse. The idea, which is not well translated by education, I know, but being an educationist in that sense, I'm wanting to, as a teacher myself, as a secondary school teacher, I tried in the best ways I knew at the time, to make our learners interested in other people than themselves. And that's particularly important, but also particularly difficult with adolescents who become very self-centered as a part of adolescence. And that, for me, was more, in a sense, more important than whether they could ultimately speak and use French because many of them wouldn't ever use French or German or whatever I was teaching. I wanted them to go, maybe, after 6 months after they left school, they wouldn't know very much French any longer, but I wanted them to go away with something which was going to, I do use the word broaden their horizons, because that's the phrase that many of my trainee teachers used to use. And I would always encourage them, trainee teachers I mean, to say, yes, okay, that's what you want to do, so how are we going to do it? And let's try to find a way of systematically doing it, rather than just hoping, as many older generation teachers would say, just hoping that when I teach a language, I teach a culture. I mean, you hear that phrase.
Sort of by osmosis, yeah. Well, there are many teachers today that still go by this.
Well, unfortunately,
shall we say, long-valued model.
Yeah, that's right, yeah.
Is there a particular incident or even epiphany that sort of fueled that move from, I'm in this classroom, obviously I'm teaching the communicative structure of another group, but there's more to their group than just the communicative structure. Was there a particular experience you went through, or with yourself, or with students you were teaching, that sort of you can pinpoint?
Well, in a sense, the chain, or the moment, if there was a kind of extended moment, if you like, was when I left school teaching myself and moved to Durham University and was given a job as a lecturer. And lecturers, in those days, the contract was very broad. It said, a third of your time is teaching, a third of your time is administration, a third of your time is research. So by chance, I moved to Durham in the middle of the year. At that point, my students, which I had not yet got to know really at all, were working in schools doing their teaching practice. So I sat in my office, which I'd been given, and from time to time went out to visit them in schools. But for the first couple of months, I had very little to do, as it were. And at that point, I began to reflect. As a school teacher, you don't have much time to reflect.
Nope, that's definitely true.
I've never been so tired in my life as when I was a school teacher. But that's, in a sense, reflecting. That was the moment, or a period of, I think, and it coincided with some of the things which were happening in British or English education, when for the first time a national curriculum was introduced. Up to that point, there was no curriculum, and everybody decided, everybody decided in practice. Any teacher could decide what they wanted to teach. There was no curriculum, except for religious studies, for some strange reason. But in the 70s, for various reasons, the change began to take place, and documents began to appear which talked about the aims and purposes of all the subjects. Why are we teaching? And that included foreign languages. And there you found things like, statements like, we teach foreign languages for communication, okay. We teach foreign languages to create a better understanding of whichever group it might be. If you're teaching French, it probably be the French. And we teach languages to create tolerance, was the phrase that I think was often used at the time. And that coincided with my own reflections. And I got involved in some of the national level discussions about all of that, and questioning, so fine, these sound wonderful ideas, but then one can ask the question, as a researcher, which I was for the first time, okay, let's take that and let's accept that that's why we do it. Now, does it happen? Is there any evidence that learning a language, in our case French, which is the dominant foreign language, is there any evidence that learning French creates better understanding of the French and tolerance of the French and or other foreign groups. And of course there was no evidence, one way or the other. And the first major project I did was to try to nail that down, and over a 3-year project to observe what was happening in a couple of local secondary schools on a daily basis, and interviewing the students and and carrying out tests and so on. It was a big project to answer the question, does language teaching change people's perspectives and attitudes towards others?
Before, I want to follow that up with moving from intercultural communicative competence into intercultural citizenship, which is what you occupy with now.
Right.
And maybe jump all the way back to finding out whether anything in your childhood or in your own educational path led you in this direction and sort of formed this, what to me sounds like a very deep value of wanting to understand, wanting to also teach understanding, or at least provide a tool set for understanding. And I can only relate my own story in that I know that as part of my upbringing of wanting to go to university was because I may not have been able to, coming from East Germany, from a former East Germany. So there was sort of not just a high value of education in general in my family, but to me also sort of like, well, if you forbid me to do this, then of course my conviction is that I have to do it, right? So has there been a moment for you in your own, going really way back in your life, sort of leading up to becoming the educator or educationist?
Well, there was in a sense, again, an epiphany, if you like. But to explain that, I need to say that I came from a working class family. I was the first generation to go to university. And my parents left school at the age of 14 and so on. So, yet, of course, well, I say of course, but they did value education, encouraged me and my brother very much. But it was, I suppose, in one sense, there was at the moment was my father was a tailor. I'll tell you the story. My father was a tailor. He would a bespoke tailor. In other words, he made clothes to fit people, and one of his customers worked in the Foreign Office, and would come to him when he was going to a hot country and get a lightweight suit made. And I thought, oh, interesting. And I think it's a job in diplomacy or the diplomatic service. Sounded wonderful, but I think also on reflection, and it was also I don't really like to use the word escape, but in a sense it was a possibility of escape. Escape from not a difficult childhood or anything like that, but escape from what I would otherwise have done, and what my parents and grandparents had done that would never left their village or their small town. That's, I suppose, the moment when I thought of, for myself, of getting out and understanding and getting involved with other people. The diplomatic corps, I now realise, or I realised very soon, pretty soon late after that, or it's not the best way to get to know other people, because the diplomatic corps is to represent your country and in some cases to be competitive with other countries, and rather than, and if you get too much involved, then that's not appropriate, as it were. Anyway, I didn't become a diplomat. I became a teacher. Well,
but through that very interesting roundabout way, if you want to describe it that way, you actually did land in the Council of Europe.
Well, yes.
It may not be the diplomatic corps, but as you pointed out, it is very much an advisory corps to the European Union, and very much a position of not just expertise, but clearly also of conviction, and trying to, as you described, the model that the Council of Europe has proposed for educating towards democratic and intercultural citizenship, the butterfly model, which very much grapples with teaching values, maybe not convictions, but certainly values. So if you want to let us into some of these perhaps not so diplomatic conversations of grappling precisely with that element, which I'm really, really interested in, you know.
The values element.
The values element. What part of parsing or what kind of negotiation did you do within the group in terms of what are values? Are there values that you can describe as a systematic basis for a certain group? I mean, we don't want to talk about nations, but just value groups or belief groups or imagined communities, whichever concept we want to use. But how did you, as a group, try to determine how to impart intercultural citizenship or teach towards intercultural citizenship? How, as a group, did you dance around with or grapple with or poke through the value discussion in the first place?
Well, in a sense, it was very simple. Because the Council of Europe states that it has three basic values, or pillars, as they call it. The word values isn't used in the general discourse. That was, in a sense, our interpretation to use the word values. But the Council of Europe is built upon a long history of declarations and treaties, etc., out of which come that our three basic pillars are human rights, the rule of law, and democracy. So that was a given. And in that sense, it makes it easy. That all we had to do, in inverted commas, was to find a way of articulating or formulating those values in ways which could be observed as competences. And there was no debate within the group. There couldn't be. We were working with and for the Council of Europe, and that was a given. I think that, and this is still early days, I think that there will be reactions to that. Not so much the three values per se, within the Council of Europe countries, the 47 countries, but there will be, and I think already has been, reaction to the question of whether you teach these values in any direct or indirect sense. And I know that, for example, in Germany, there has one of our colleagues on the group has done presentations and found this may be a simplification, but a division between a group of people would say, yes, we've got to teach values, yes, we've got to teach citizenship and democracy. That is something that we've been doing since the Second World War, the end of the Second World War, under the phrase politische Bildung. And others have said, no, we shouldn't be teaching values. That leads you into indoctrination. And the two groups, not surprisingly, tend to come from the former West Germany and the former East Germany. And the people from East Germany are afraid of this becoming indoctrination and their own and saying, well, we've had enough of that in our own experience. And you may have some comment upon that yourself, I don't know. So they're controversial, they're controversial in the sense that it should or should not be part of the teaching. They're not controversial in the sense that I said that the Council of Europe just has them, and it's something that all the members of the Council of Europe have signed up to long ago.
So the guidelines for intercultural or for teaching intercultural citizenship themselves are not controversial. The implementation of same can be controversial.
Yes, yeah.
Do you see yourself as, shall we say, a traveler of the document, trying to help people implement it? In a way, are some of your own convictions behind it such that you would say, all right, I'm definitely going to help you teach it?
Yes, the short answer, yes. There are things which still need to be developed further, and there will be, there is the beginnings of a network of people to implement. So implementation is a complex matter, but what I've been doing, and other members of the group, of course, have also been, whenever the opportunity has arisen, like today and here, to present this. And yes, I'm behind it. Some of the documents which help to implement it and the guides on how to do it, I think we will have to be improved upon. The whole thing was written very quickly because of the political pressures. I don't think that there will be any changes in the basic model, not for a long time anyway, but I think there will be more and more documentation and suggestions and workshops about what this means in practice and how this can be implemented in practice.
Can you give a very quick synopsis of how you define intercultural citizenship?
Intercultural citizenship is the competence to be able to interact with someone from another national group, usually, but another social group in some cases, and any social group, to work together towards some common aim, which is greater than what either of the two groups or any of the 3 or 4 groups, it can be more, could achieve itself. That, in a sense, you could say is just good citizenship, which could take place within a country, groups of different communities coming together, both in the sense of a local community or in a sense of two professional communities coming together to do something. The intercultural and dimension and the intercultural communicative competence dimension is that I think there's a difference when a foreign language is involved, or at least when, for one of the groups at least, they're using a language other than their dominant language. Because that brings in, first of all, it challenges the taken for granted concepts in both languages in the situation. And secondly, it brings in usually an international perspective, or at least the perspective of another linguistic group. Of course, one can have several linguistic groups within one country, but within traditional language teaching in Europe, the other is another country, is the people who speak French or German or Spanish. Those are the 3 big languages. And of course, in other European countries, English. The groups in question are then the French, the Germans, the Spanish, which you have then to break down, because otherwise you end up in stereotypes.
Oh, yeah,
but it's a question of then bringing students together to work with students from those other groups on something pretty narrow. I mean, you're not talking about what we can do for France or England or whatever, what we can do in our community, but bringing another international, there's no better word than international in a sense, or anyway, a perspective from a different country and a different way of thinking. And you get that difference even within Europe. I say that because I go a lot to East Asia, and often you hear people saying, "Oh, well, it's just the West." Well, it's not.
Blob, yes.
That's right. Yeah, that's going off on a different different tangent.
That's a different tangent. That's right. Well, what fascinates me about this is, on the one hand, that values can be taught, or that there's the assumption that values can be taught, and of course, the European Union has come together under a certain set of values that you correctly point out.
The Council of Europe.
Council of Europe.
Yeah.
That you correctly point out are European values, or Western European values.
Well, that all the former Eastern European, or the geographically, everybody has signed up to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But of course, we all know that reality is different, and we may sign up for something, but once there's an element that we don't like, or that doesn't jive with our values or our ways of living, then that gets dissected pretty quickly. And so what I'm interested in is in a way your take on, okay, there are certain sets of values that any which group subscribe to in order to be a group, certain social understandings by which the group functions. And then, at least in my understanding of convictions, which are much stronger beliefs, which are much more emotionally charged stances about whatever, about religion, about one's family, about certain ways of behavior, moral, personal. What I'm interested in is sort of figuring out how can we also teach this element of clashing, having convictions clash, having values being so emotionally charged that they're beyond any kind of self-reflection or intellectual argument or even logical argument, that the other gets not erased but at least not listened to. I think listening is a very important element in the teaching of intercultural citizenship. Do you want to maybe ponder on that a little bit? It's like, when does the listening stop? When does the conviction tie itself so much into one's own emotional DNA that if one were to give up the conviction or tone it down or say, you know what, that was actually stupid, one denies oneself? I mean, that's sort of one thing I'm grappling with, because there's a value system and there's a value agreement. But when it comes to personal moral conviction, be it, again, religious or of any other nature, we all get tone deaf.
Yes, and I mean, you've mentioned religious, and it often is religious, but not only. I think I would approach it from this perspective of what the teacher can and cannot do, and cannot is also as important to what they can do. And I used to say this also to my trainee teachers, who are often very ambitious in what they hope to be able to do, and one has to accept there are limitations. But I mean, one way of looking at it is say, well, if a person or student has deeply held convictions, which might well be religious, and they, as a consequence of that, they make certain judgments, and if it's in a language classroom, if that's my experience, there might be judgments about another group speaking another language, and it might be another country. They will make judgments. The teacher has to take their own perspective on this and say, well, is it my job to try to change the values on which that judgment has been made, or is it my job, and that will be my view, to help the person or the students in question to become more conscious of the values and the convictions that are behind the judgments that they're making. And in that sense, I'm a rationalist. In that sense, I think if you bring things to the surface and you can use reason, I still hope that reason will overcome prejudice. Oh,
we'll have to have a conversation about that.
Yeah. But I also know the limitations. That's what I mean. That the teacher has to accept there might be limitations, and there are some things you cannot. It's not a matter of changing. There's some things you cannot even help teach people to bring to consciousness and to conscious observation.
There has to be a certain openness to even entertain the notion of reflection.
Yeah,
absolutely.
And it's, of course, a very slow process. And again, with my trainee teachers, who often come into teaching with ideas that they might change the world, as it were, have to be a little less ambitious and have a long-term view. But that's my way of thinking about the convictions, and what you've said about convictions and so on. It helps me and will help me to think a bit more carefully about this notion of critical cultural awareness, which is something we haven't really mentioned yet, but which I see as part of part of intercultural competence as taught in schools, because anybody can teach. I mean, somebody in a language, a private language or a language school training people in commerce to go in a foreign language to go and sell something in another country or negotiate or whatever in another country. They also need intercultural competence.
Right.
They need all the skills and attitudes of intercultural competence taught in schools. But what I add to that is this notion of critical cultural awareness. And I've begun to try to say that that's a matter of bringing to consciousness the values and perhaps convictions, and that's a word I haven't myself used in the past, the values and convictions which are below and which are driving the judgments that young people make unthinkingly often.
Well, that's the fascinating part to me, which is why I'm delving more and more into affect studies or emotional biographies, if you will. We think a lot about our education, our upbringing, what was taught to us, what did we learn tacitly through picking it up through our families or our family systems. We don't very much think about our emotional history or the makeup or the programming, the emotional programming that we grew up with. Why do I have certain reactions that are visceral rather than even thought about? And luckily, emotionally or thankfully, emotional research has determined that, well, emotional programming or your emotional makeup actually is very much cultural. It's not universal. There are certain behaviors that are taught. There are certain emotional reactions that are picked up, learned. They're not part of nature. So to me, it's become a very interesting a very interesting endeavor to look at conviction as something that is also obviously a very emotional expression, because it is partly informed by knowledge, but is also very much a question of what type of knowledge and knowledge from whom, which discourse is this knowledge part of, and which group validates this knowledge and which group disowns this knowledge, and why is it fought for so valiantly, so emotionally. So obviously the emotion part is a very strong element within conviction, whereby values may not be so emotionally charged. They may actually be more an element of intellectual values, of, again, group agreements that we agree to think of education as a valuable asset of society. So to me, this emotional element really marks a lot of what conviction is, but of course it's also something that we don't reflect on very much. We don't actually write our autobiography when it comes to, well, I remember being marked in this way, therefore I have this reaction to X. That's actually one of the most unreflected elements of our life, no matter how many diaries we write, facetiously talking, or how much we can sort of spill to our best friend. But to me, I'm also wondering whether conviction can become a self-reflected element of our lives, because especially in this day and age, and especially moving towards intercultural citizenship, it behooves us to think about, well, do I believe in a certain religious document because it was taught to me and because it ties me to my group? And I have habituated certain elements and ways of being that make me who I am and that make me feel at home? Or is this a clash with other convictions whereby I've essentially cut myself off from any kind of self-reflection? I mean, in a way, this is intercultural work, but it's more than value system work. It's really a lot more of taking an emotional, taking the pulse of one's emotional DNA or one's emotional makeup. I'm grappling for words here. And I wonder whether that can be taught, or whether that self-reflection can be integrated into education. Because as you say, there's a limit. we can't reach everybody. And obviously, the person who wants to share needs to be open. But if the openness is blocked, where are we going?
And that's I think what's missing, if you like, in pedagogy. That I often say somewhat flippantly that we have a pedagogy for knowledge, but we don't have a pedagogy of the emotions. And I suppose traditionally that's what schools are focused upon, knowledge and not emotions. I think schools in the last 50 years, of course, have changed a lot, and what they see as their remit, if you like, has become much more complex. But nonetheless, in the classroom, as opposed to in the school as a whole, where other things might be happening, pastoral work and so on. But in the classroom and in connection with a particular subject, then I don't know what I didn't know, and I still don't know what to say to my trainee teachers when they meet with emotional reaction. And if you teach German, I'm afraid I have to say, if you teach German, there are still, well, it's sometimes since I was directly involved either as a teacher or a teacher trainer, but I wouldn't be surprised if it's still the case that there's still a lot of post-Second World War reactions to German among young people whose grandparents had been, or maybe great-grandparents in some cases, had been involved in the Second World War. But it's still there. And I and my trainee German teachers had moments when you had to cope with the child who comes up and says, "Heil Hitler." That happened to me. Right. That's happened. And how do you deal with that? I'm still not sure. Yeah, and certainly not sure how to give a kind of training or a systematic preparation for that. Yeah. And that's what's missing.
Yeah. Well, that's the interesting part about trying to frame, call it emotional, call it irrational, but trying to frame these elements within a discourse that has been based on rationality.
Yes.
Which of course, within the Council of Europe, that's
the way we think.
The premise. Yes,
that's right.
Exactly. Yeah. Is there any kind of you give a certain toolkit to your teacher trainees, and you very liberally also tell them, listen, there are limits, of course. Would you give a certain toolkit beyond the intercultural citizenship guidelines or recommendations? If there were a 16-year-old youth coming to you, trying to really negotiate his political and personal identity in this day and age in Europe for the context, would you give her or him a certain toolkit for dealing with values, dealing with convictions? Would you have a certain advice?
I think there are techniques, and the Council of Europe, there's been a lot of work over the years, in a sense separate. One of the problems is it's been separate, but that's a different matter. But work on racism, basically, and ways of trying to develop techniques for dealing with racism, often in informal education as opposed to formal education, by which I mean formal education, thinking of schools and teaching a subject. Informal education might be in youth work and that kind of sphere. And in that sense, there are toolboxes. To what extent they solve the problem, it will always be, I suppose, limited again. But yes, I could point to, well, you asked me what would I give to the person. I suppose the things I'm thinking of are more for teachers. So in that sense, I can't think of a toolbox to give to a 16-year-old, but a 16-year-old who was looking for a toolbox, in a sense, wouldn't need one. It would already be somebody who's reflective and reflexive. It's the 16-year-olds who are not thinking and not wanting to change, improve, become a better person, as it were, who need the guidance.
Who needs to find a way to teacher training is
Yeah.
Michael, thank you very, very much for this wonderful
Well,
conversation.
it's been an interesting discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. The Conviction Project is part of the Humility and Conviction in Public Life project at the University of Connecticut, created with the generous support of the John Templeton Foundation.